Welcome, everybody. Thanks for coming on this sunny afternoon. I'm happy to welcome Dr. Myriam Lapierre to Western, she is assistant professor of linguistics at the University of Washington, received her PhD from the University of California, Berkeley, along with our very own Professor Dawson. Dr. Lapierre's research combines phonological theory, original fieldwork, articulatory and perceptual phonetics, and in-depth typological surveys. Her theoretical work centers on formal models of representational phonology, and in particular, the role of segmental representations within phonological grammar. Myriam specializes in the sound systems of Amazonian languages of Brazil, and she's carried out extensive typological research on the typology of nasal oral alternations among indigenous languages spoken all over Amazonia, which we'll hear more about today. So without further ado, I'll turn it over.
Thank you. Thank you, Kristen, and thanks everyone for having me. It's really fun to be here in Bellingham with everyone today. Okay, so today I'll be talking about particular sound patterns in Panãra, which is the language that I've done the most field work on today. And I'll be talking about implications of this research, both for theoretical phonology, experimental phonetics, and also for the community of speakers of the language in terms of orthography development. All right. Okay, so as a starting point, field research has increasingly become a collaborative endeavor with native speaker communities within the field of linguistics over the last 20 or 30 years. And in this influential paper, Leonard and Hayes call for a paradigm shift in how field research is approached. They say true collaboration can be incorporated under the common constraints of academic research, such as deadlines, legal requirements for human research, and productivity. And later, Leonard calls for a decolonial approach, which means not just considering community needs, but actually starting from community needs in conceiving of language documentation and the development of field projects. So in today's talk, I'll present a case study from Panãra showing how the advancement of science and of community goals can be developed simultaneously and in synergy. So to give you a brief overview, I'll start with a little bit of background on fieldwork with the Panãra community. Then I'll talk about the scientific outcomes, so looking at two types of nasal consonant oral stop sequences in the language. And then we'll talk about orthography development and literacy advancement in the community with a brief conclusion after that. And if you have any clarification questions at any point, feel free to stop me so I can make sure that everybody's on the same page as we're going through this. Okay, so the Panãra community is located in the Panãra indigenous land, which is here. The village where I collected the majority of the fieldwork that I'll be presenting today is here. It's called Nansepatiti, right under this blue little pointer here. And the Panãra indigenous land is part of a broader geographic area called the Xingu, if any of you have heard about it, is one of the most linguistically diverse areas of the world, and it's the area that's in this blue box here in central Brazil. There's about 700 speakers of the language, so we're talking about a really small community here, and this particular community I've been working with for about a decade now. This is what the village of Nansepatiti looks like. So you can see a lot of thatch houses, wooden houses, and you can't tell from the picture, but the villages are very circular. JEG communities, of which the Panãra are a member, tend to have these very circular villages that have different clans oriented with different cardinal directions, or specifically the position of the sun. So you can't tell from this picture, but there's a circle, and I'm taking the picture from one end of the circle. And this, I want to just give a shout out to some of the people who've had the most influence on my career in general, but this particular research. This is my adoptive family. So, sorry, I'm having trouble with the mouse. I'll figure it out at some point. This is Sakare, she's my adoptive mother, and Kuka, my adoptive father, and my two adoptive sisters, Tampe and Tutiti, hiding in the back over there. All right. And this is Kanempu. She's one of the leading female leaders in the community. She was actually born before the time of contact with Brazilian National Society. And so she grew up really when she was a teenager, without any contact with, Western civilization, so to speak. And she's had a major role in kind of the transition of the community from that era into, the adoption of some Western cultural aspects. And a couple of other very influential elders, in particular, Aka here was one of the people who was involved in the reclamation of the part of their land that the Panãra now occupy. So about 50 to 70 years ago, the Panãra indigenous land as it was occupied by Brazilian settlers, mostly miners and farmers. And Aka was the leader at the time who really was at the forefront of the reclamation of the land that they now inhabit. And this is his wife, Koteti. All right. So the research program that I'm presenting here emerged as a result of community engaged fieldwork. From the very beginning of my time working with the Panãra community, the community was really interested in developing Panãra language workshops, which they call Panãra Peokia, that literally means Panãra language writing. And it was very clear from the very beginning of my time working with them that the language makes really fine-grained distinctions in nasality. So nasality was one of the topics that was always recurring in our discussions in these literacy workshops. And these phonetic sequences that you might transcribe in IPA as a nasal consonant followed by an oral obstruent, they kind of are everywhere in the language. But from the beginning, it was confusing that in some cases, they would write these NT sequences with a nasal consonant orthographically and sometimes without it. They also use terms like pasiteti, which means heavy, and pasipepeti, which means light, to describe nasality in different phonological environments. They also would transcribe some oral vowels as nasal and some nasal vowels as oral. And so there was a lot going on that obviously I needed to understand better, and that was going to have an impact on the orthography development. So that's kind of what drew me to this question from the beginning. So in considering the community's goals, when they invited me to work with them, one of the main priorities that they had was to develop an orthography of Panãra that was intuitive and practical for them to use. They wanted to increase rates of literacy in the native language. In particular, this is motivated by a need to communicate via social media. And that's a major issue because until I started working with the community, the use of social media was basically restricted to using Portuguese. The vast majority of speakers in the community aren't native speakers of Portuguese, and social media is a very present part of everyday life. And of course, developing pedagogical materials for the school, which basically has the consequence of elevating the social prestige of the community. In terms of my own goals, I was very interested in writing a phonological grammar of the language and publishing various scientific articles on the sound systems of the language. And so there's actually a very large degree of compatibility there. The development of an orthography requires a very thorough understanding of the phonological grammar of the language. And so these two things then were a very good starting point for a collaboration between me and the Panãra community. So let's start by talking about these two types of NT sequences, nasal consonant oral obstruents, and some impacts of this particular pattern for phonological representations. Okay, so as a starting point, if you've taken Intro to Phonology, you've probably learned about segments and features, right? Phonemes and features as kind of the basic atoms that we take as premises for phonological representation. But there's a very large body of converging evidence that in fact, speakers of languages have much more fine-grained, detailed phonetic knowledge of the sound patterns of their language than can be captured with just this idea of segments and phonological features. There's also some types of segments that occur kind of across the board, cross-linguistically, that aren't so straightforwardly captured by traditional phonological representation. So if you think of, for example, the complex nasal stop mb, or the affricate tsa, cha, or even diphthongs like I, ow, it's not so straightforward how we might capture that with a set of phonological features. So with that, there's been a new wave of research in subsegmental representations within the field of phonology over the last 20 years or so. Okay, so the main claim here for this particular case study is that Panãra exhibits a phonological distinction between two types of what we call NT sequences that arise from two distinct phonological processes. One is a process where oral obstruents, which I write with a capital T to just represent all places of articulation, are prenasalized. And another is a phonological process where nasal consonants, which I write with a capital N to represent different places of articulation, are post-oralized, okay? So I'll show you what that looks like. But just before we get into that, here's the phonological inventory of the language, so you can have a sense of kind of what we're working with. So the language has a series of obstruents, p, t, s, k, and nasals, men, n, and a series of approximants. And the obstruents and the nasals contrast for short and long. So we have short and long stops and nasals. We also have 9 different oral vowel qualities. 6 of them can be nasal, and nearly all of them contrast for short versus long. So we have 28 phonemic vowels, which is very high. Okay. So if we look at the data, if we look at the distribution of nasal consonants and these NT segments in the language, what we find is that they're in complementary distribution, meaning that they don't occur in the same phonological environment. So we get plain nasal consonants occurring before phonemically nasal vowels in words like mamu, nompion, nyansu, and nga. And we never find plain nasal consonants before oral vowels. Instead, what we find is that we see these NT sequences in that same environment before a phonemically oral vowel. So we get words like impu, inta, nanso, and ink. So we can say then that nasal consonants are realized as post-oralized before a phonemically oral vowel, and they're realized as plain nasals before nasal vowels, or you could say elsewhere. Okay. We find a very similar kind of complementary distribution between oral obstruents, plain oral obstruents, and NT sequences again. So we find plain oral obstruents after phonemically oral vowels or at the beginning of a word in words like pepeti, soti, ase, and kuka. And we find these NT sequences again after phonemically nasal vowels in words like kiampa, sonta, nyanseri, and sonkerasa. So we can say then that we see this complementary distribution between the plain, between the obstruents, where they're prenasalized after a nasal vowel, and they're realized as plain obstruents after an oral vowel. So far, so good? All right. Okay. So to summarize, we see these NT sequences that seem to arise from 2 distinct phonological processes in Panãra. One is post-oralization of nasal consonants, and the other is prenasalization of oral obstruents. But crucially, we actually find minimal pairs in the lexicon in the environment after a nasal vowel and before an oral vowel. And so we get minimal pairs like this, minkere, which means alligator egg, and minkere, which means alligator burrow. And there's other minimal pairs for other places of articulation. This is one of many. And notably, in a very famous paper written by Ian Madison and Peter Ladefoged in an edited volume on nasality in 1993, they did a survey of languages that had post-oralized nasals and prenasalized stops, and they came to the conclusion that there seemed to be several ways in which orally released nasals differ from prenasalized stops phonetically, but it's not clear that distinct phonological structures are involved. And this is specifically because they say that they don't know of any language in which those 2 classes of sounds actually contrast with each other. And then further on, they go on to say that the lack of phonological distinction between those 2 types of NT sequences is actually well predicted by a theory of phonology developed by Donka Steriati in the same book, which is called aperture theory. I'll come back to that in a few minutes. Okay, So our questions then for this case study are, what, if any, are the differences in the articulation between the two types of NTs? And then how does that inform theories of phonological representation? We'll start with the first question. So in order to answer that question, I carried out an articulatory experiment with Susan Lin. And the words that we selected for native speakers of Panãra to produce involve the following phonological environments. So we have syllables that have nasal consonants followed by a nasal vowel, oral obstruents followed by a nasal vowel, nasal consonant followed by an oral vowel, and oral obstruent followed by an oral vowel. So all the logically possible permutations of nasal and oral. And then we made all of those syllables appear both after a nasal vowel and after an oral vowel. Okay, so from this, we have a particular subset that gives us the right phonological environment for pre-nasalization to occur in pink and post-oralization to occur in blue. And we recorded 40 native speakers of Panãra. The data that I'm showing you here is from 7 speakers. And each one of these words was produced 5 times by the participants in the experiment in semi-randomized blocks. When we were recording them, we recorded both sounds, so acoustic recordings, as well as oral and nasal airflow data using an EGG D800. So what is an EGG D800? It looks like this. It's like a little box that looks like a very large hard drive, but it's very transportable and easy to take to the field. This is Pukyara here. He's holding a mask. It's made of silicone, and it's basically a mask like, any mask that you might be familiar with, except that it has a division between the nose and the mouth, so that there's 2 separate chambers in the mask. And you can see these 2 little tubes here. So there's one connected to the chamber with the mouth, and there's one connected to the chamber with the nose. And each one of these tubes is connected to the EGG D800, and that allows us to record airflow coming out of the nose and airflow coming out of the mouth separately. Okay. Okay, so here I'm showing you a spectrogram of a post-oralized token on the left and a pre-nasalized token on the right. And on the top here, what you have is the nasal airflow channel. I'm gonna oh no, I'm not gonna be able to play them. Yeah, sorry. I could pull up my laptop. Maybe we could try. It won't be very loud, but
we thought we checked it all.
I thought, yeah, the PDF conversion was, let's see. Okay. Slide through. Okay. So are you ready?
Meta.
One more time.
Meta.
Can you hear the difference? Yeah, it took me years to hear the difference. Okay, but if we look at them, what you'll see here is that for the post-oralized token, we see acoustic nasality persisting during a much greater proportion of this stop closure on the left compared to the right. And this is corroborated by the nasal airflow trace that we see at the top there. Okay. And also in terms of the frequency at which these 2 processes occur, we find that post-oralization occurs in 100% of tokens where we have a nasal consonant vowel sequence. And the pre-nasalization doesn't occur all the time. It occurs about 73% of the time. And there's variation across speakers in terms of how frequently they pre-nasalize, with female speakers pre-nasalizing more frequently than male speakers. Okay, so in order to do some phonetic analysis of the data that I'm showing you here, we're going to be paying attention to 3 articulatory events that occur in this nasal vowel, NT, oral vowel sequence, okay? So in all of the target words, we're going to be looking at a sequence consisting of those 4 segments. Within this sequence of sounds, we have a velum raising event. So during the NT sequence, the velum is raised for the production of the oral obstruent and oral vowel. We also have an oral constriction. So there's some oral constriction, say maybe the lips are closed or the tongue tip is raised to the crown of the mouth to produce this dental or alveolar consonant here. So we have a constriction that's achieved somewhere here and released before the vowel or at the vowel. And then we have the end of voicing that occurs at some point during the NT sequence, where we go from a voice to a voiceless sound here. Okay, so with the data, we'll be identifying these landmarks, these articulatory landmarks, first with some of the airflow data, okay? So to orient you to this graph here, what we have on the x-axis is time, and on the y-axis, we have airflow with the blue line representing nasal airflow and the yellow line representing oral airflow, okay? So the onset of velic closure, meaning the time point at which the velum begins to rise, is identified here on this graph. And the achievement of velic closure is identified here on the graph with these inflection curves. The achievement of oral constriction is the left arrow, and the onset of oral release is the right arrow. And then finally, the time point at which vocal fold vibration ends is identified with this dotted line here, okay? So the particular graph that you were looking at is the graph for that same token that you just heard, minta. So that's a post-oralized token on the right. And on the left, we have the graph for the token, the prenasalized token that you heard. And if we compare them, you'll notice this. The time point at which the velum begins to rise, the oral constriction is achieved, and the voicing ends for the prenasalized token all seem to be aligned with respect to each other, kind of occurring at the same time. But if we look at the post-oralized token on the right here, instead what we find is that first the oral constriction is achieved, and then after some time into the stop closure, voicing ends, and only after that does the velum begin to rise, and very shortly before the stop is released, full raising of the velum is achieved. All right. So we did some measures by calculating intervals of time between these different articulatory measures. We calculated oral lag, which we define as the time point from which the velum begins to rise, minus the time point at which the oral constriction is achieved. Velum raising time, which is the time point at which the velum is fully raised, minus the time point at which the velum begins to rise. And then voicing lag, which is the time point at which the velum is fully raised, minus the time point at which vocal fold vibration ends. Okay. So we then ran some statistics, specifically linear mixed effects models with subject and word as random effects. And what we'll find by comparing the duration of these articulatory events for the prenasalized versus post-oralized NTs is that there's a significant difference between the two for all of these articulatory measures. And specifically, the duration of those measures for the post-oralized NTs in orange is always greater than that for the prenasalized NTs in blue. Okay, so we started off this particular case study asking what, if any, are the differences in the articulation between the two types of NTs. And what we can say is that post-oralization is realized with greater oral lag, velum raising time, and voicing. Okay, great. Now, moving on to our second question, how does this data inform theories of segmental representation? Okay. So coming back to kind of the basics of phonological representation that you might have learned in Intro to Phonology, we'll start with this idea that we have segmental units, something like phonemes, and then we can attach binary phonological features to those phonemes. So we would have something like plus nasal and minus nasal. So if we take those two premises, then that allows us to make phonemes that are phones that are plus nasal and phones that are minus nasal, but it doesn't even allow us to represent something like a post-oralized NT or a prenasalized NT. because this predicts that all segments should be uniformly oral or nasal. So the Panãra data that we're seeing doesn't support this hypothesis here. So let's move on instead to aperture theory, which was the theory that I alluded to at the beginning of my discussion of this case study. So aperture theory, coincidentally, was developed specifically to account for segments of the type that we're seeing here. So specifically what you might call a prenasalized stop, or something like an affricate. And the idea is that in the production of these kinds of stops and affricates, we can have two distinct phases, a stop closure and a stop release. Each one of these can then be associated with a different phonological feature. So this is great because it allows us to represent the closure phase as plus nasal and the release phase as minus nasal. So the temporal ordering between those two parts of the segment. But again, we're running into an issue, which is that this doesn't predict that a contrast between post-oralized nasals and prenasalized stops should be possible, because in fact, they should be represented phonologically in exactly the same way. So the Panãra data that we're seeing here doesn't support this hypothesis either. So what shall we do? I'll introduce a new phonological model here, which is called Q theory. Q theory has very much the same premise as the other theories that we've considered, which is that segments are composed of quantized elements. So quantized means phases. And in particular, Q theory divides three phases of a segment: the closure phase, so the gesture, the part of a gesture where articulators say come together for a stop closure. So say the lips coming together for a labial stop. The hold phase, the time during which they remain held and closed. And then the release phase, the movement of those articulators away from the closure, which we represent here as Q1, Q2, and Q3. Each one of these, again, can be associated with its own phonological features. So if we take this, the premise of this phonological theory, in fact, what we predict is that a contrast between these two types of NT sequences actually should be possible. And indeed, this is what we find in Panãra. So the two types of NTs in this language then would support a tripartite division of the segment, where the prenasalized stops have the movement toward the closure associated with a nasal feature, and then the hold phase and the release phase associated with minus nasal feature. And the post-oralized nasal segments are associated with two nasal features, and then the release phase being minus nasal. Okay. So to summarize, I've showed you a case study from Panãra, where we have two distinct types of NTs that arise from two different phonological processes, prenasalization and post-oralization, and I've showed you evidence from nasal airflow data. And we've taken this data as evidence in favor of a tripartite model of the segment, where post-oralized nasals have two nasal subsegments and one oral subsegment, and the prenasalized stops have one nasal subsegment and two oral subsegments. Okay, so with that, let's change gears and discuss the consequences of these findings for the Panãra community in terms of literacy education and orthography development within an Amazonian community. Okay, so I'll start by giving you a little bit of orientation to the socio-political, socio-educational landscape of the community. So Panãra is spoken in 6 villages that are all located in the Panãra indigenous land. And there aren't any notable dialectal differences between the present day villages. There is sociolinguistic variation in the community of elders who were born before contact. But in terms of the people who are writing the language, who are, say, my age or perhaps a little bit younger, there isn't any notable sociolinguistic variation there. You can ask me about it later if you're curious. And I'd say probably roughly 75% of the population is below the age of 40. Panãra is the primary language that's used by all speakers of the community. So it's one of those rare indigenous communities where the native language is actually totally vital. And I would say basically everybody is dominant in Panãra and functionally monolingual. There are some people in the community who are bilingual to various degrees, and those tend to be men in their 30s or above, who have varying degrees of proficiency in Brazilian Portuguese. Some don't speak it at all, and others are quite fluent. And women in general understand Portuguese, but don't really speak it, either because they don't want to or they can't. In terms of literacy rates, both in Panãra and in Portuguese, those are generally very low. Men and children have some degrees of literacy, though I wouldn't say anybody in the community is fully comfortable with writing and say somebody who has, a university degree in the United States. And in particular, women and elders have no knowledge of any orthography at all. Education in the community is available for primary school entirely in Panãra by Panãra school teachers, and secondary education has very, very recently become available. And generally they'll hire a Brazilian teacher who comes and works in one or two of the villages. And very recently, there's been a cohort of about 30, now probably maybe 40 young Panãra, mostly men, have begun undergraduate degrees for the first time. And they're going to graduate with their post-secondary degrees sometime very soon in the next couple of years or so, for the first time in the community's history. So that's really exciting. Okay, in terms of literacy development, we have a few notable challenges. The first one is funding for the program. So the money to fund workshops and print materials so far has been entirely limited to my research grants, which is enough to do some things, but maybe not as much as, the whole array of things that we would want to do. And the vast majority of the funding for the workshops is associated to the fact that the Panãra community still practice subsistence farming and agriculture. So they hunt, fish, and farm every day. And this means that if for an entire week, all of the adults in the village are participating in a literacy workshop, nobody is hunting, fishing, and farming, and so there's no food for their families to eat. And so essentially the workshop funding requires feeding the entire village for a week. There's also very limited access to electricity and internet in the village. Very recently, they got Starlink internet, which has limited accessibility, but very little. There's also not really any written materials that exist. There is one published book that unfortunately doesn't adhere to the community's orthography conventions, and those books tend to disappear very quickly. The Panãra land is also quite isolated. So in terms of communicating information from one village to another, we have about 6 villages who are, anywhere between 2 and 4 hours away from each other. And until very recently, we're only communicated by boat. So we're talking about twice as far to travel to another village. Most of the community isn't literate, meaning that we have a starting point where the vast majority of people in the workshops don't have any knowledge of any alphabet. And those that do have knowledge of an alphabet have interference from those other orthography conventions that they've learned, say from the previous Panãra orthography that I'll talk about in a minute, or from Brazilian Portuguese. And then there's the language-specific complexities of Panãra. So recall that the Latin alphabet has 5 or 6 vowel symbols, and Panãra grammar has 28 contrastive vowels. So that's a lot more vowels than the Latin alphabet allows us to represent. There's also a distinction between vowel and consonant length. There's nasality. So there's use of various diacritics to represent vowel nasality, but unfortunately on phone keyboards, neither of the symbols that can be used are available for all the vowel symbols. So that's a problem. Okay, so in terms of the first phonological description of the language that appeared before I started working with the community, this was published in 1990, and it presented the phonemic inventory that you see here. The phonemic inventory that I discovered or analyzed, or whatever way you want to put it, has a number of differences from the previous one. Among them is the presence of long consonants. both for the plain stops and the nasals, 2 additional places of articulation for the nasal consonants, and then a whole series of long vowels. There's also particular issues in terms of the usability of the previous orthography with the representation of nasality. So nasality, as you probably all have experienced at some point, can be very difficult to perceive. And, field linguists working on languages are not immune to this complexity of phonology, of transcribing sounds. So in the language, we have a number of contrasts. I gave you some examples earlier, but we have a number of contrasts, very small differences relating to nasality and orality. So we have, for instance, this minimal triplet, ton-si, and ton-si, which mean respectively large whole, siblings bone, and something like large sibling. But in the previous orthography, those were all written in the exact same way. And so you can imagine how many lexical differences were being collapsed and how difficult it was to read the language. And this is because the particular NC sequences that we have in this minimal triplet that I just gave you, according to the previous analysis of the phonology of the language, were prenasalized stops. Now, as I've showed you, the language does have prenasalized stops, but these particular NT sequences are not prenasalized. They're post-oralized. And so if we assume that they are prenasalized, that means that the nasality is coming from a preceding vowel. But as you'll see, not all those vowels are actually nasal. That's because they contrast. They can be oral or nasal. But essentially, in being taught how to use this orthography, speakers of the language were taught to write consonant nasality as a tilde on a vowel that preceded the consonant. And so, what is the consequence of this? Sometimes speakers write oral vowels as nasal, and sometimes they write nasal consonants as oral. Okay, so there's a lot of confusion going on. And essentially, when I started working with the community, this orthography wasn't in use. It existed, and there were a couple of people who had been taught how to use it, but it wasn't intuitive for them. And they also didn't really have any resources for teaching other people how to use it or for, becoming more proficient in it themselves. And so until about 2015, virtually nobody in the community was writing in Panãra at all. And unfortunately, this is a pretty widespread situation across the Amazon and other indigenous communities. Sergio Almeida, who is a phonologist who's worked with speakers of Bakairi. Bakairi is another indigenous community in the Amazon who live not too far from the Panãra, did some similar work and reported in a paper that speakers of the dialect of Bakairi, for which the orthography was a poor fit, didn't correct the problem. They just abandoned writing in their language altogether. Okay, so in working with the community on orthography development, the methodology that I employed followed this very short article by Andrew Nevins and Denny Moore that was developed to work with the Sudowi of Rondônia, a very close indigenous group nearby. So the methodology is pretty straightforward. First, there's an assessment phase where we compile a list of, a maximum number of minimal pairs that illustrate all the phonological contrasts known to exist in the language. So in the case of Panãra, this would be oral and nasal vowels, short and long vowels, short and long consonants, different degrees of height and backness for vowel contrast, place and manner for consonants, and this distinction between post-oralized and prenasalized NTs. And then we collect a list of samples of writing from people who have knowledge of writing in the community, have them write this list of 30 or so minimal pairs, and then present aggregated anonymous results to the community. So essentially collect all the papers and then one at a time present all the ways in which every word was written anonymously and have everybody read them out loud, kind of assessing which ones might be a better representation of that word. Eliminating them essentially one at a time, and at times when there aren't ways of representing contrasts that actually do exist, the linguist makes proposals on, possible ways of encoding that distinction. So for example, a long vowel could be written with 2 A's, maybe with a colon representing something similar to the IPA, or maybe with an H. And in this model, community members who are the main users of the orthography make all the decisions. So over the years, the workshops began to center around the emergent Panãra alphabet with explicit discussions of each one of the letters that was encoded in the alphabet. So this one was one of the most recent orthography workshops that I had, where we instead started with the letters that have appeared in previous texts and listing a bunch of words that include that letter. And then from there, building on more complex writing activities, so going from the representation of words to the representation of sentences by transcribing actual texts spoken by elders in the community. Okay, so this here is Sopoa. He's transcribing here a story about a snake woman who coincidentally is the origin of white people in the community. You can ask me more about that story if you want later. So the workshops that I've been organizing with the school teachers have developed so much over the last 10 years. The very first workshop that we had 8 participants and lasted only 2 days. And you'll notice that the number of participants has been kind of increasing continuously until last year I was working mostly with children and teenagers rather than adults for the very first time. And we've just been kind of working on issues relating to particular letters, and then moving on for particular letters to words, and then sentences and issues relating to technology. In South America, whenever we organize a workshop, participants receive a certificate. So this was the very first cohort of participants in the first workshop, and this was the people who received certificates for participating in the 2019 workshop, just to kind of give you a sense of the growth of the group over the years. And in particular, the dynamic between the junior and senior teachers, the elders and the students has developed in a way that is very much a representation of Panãra-specific Indigenous pedagogy. We started with this very simple model by Andrew Devins and Denny Moore, and the Panãra have really just made it their own, kind of turning the dynamic in the workshops into ways that they have traditionally, historically made decisions within the community. So just to give you a sense, in the last workshops, we had 44 people, and that's really because that is the maximum amount of physical space that we had in the school. You can see all the desks are touching here. This is Kuka. He's one of the main teachers, and here he was teaching students the difference between short and long vowels. And another view of the classroom here. So crucially, within this model, linguists are consultants that propose solutions on the basis of, their knowledge of phonological grammar, language structures, and should refrain from influencing decisions about standardization conventions. So being a little bit more agnostic, like listing out the pros and cons of a particular solution over another, like if there's a known keyboard complexity or unavailability of a particular symbol, that might be worth noting. But the community members who are the experts and primary users of the writing system are the ones who make the decisions. And it's also worth noting the importance of the work that happens after the workshop. So during this 1 week-long event, we bring together people who are interested in writing the language, and we talk about the different issues having to do with the orthography of the language. But after the workshop, people go on to actually use that on social media, or maybe, writing. I've seen a lot of signs for the school now that get printed and posted on the walls in Panãra orthography. And sometimes people don't reach a decision about the best way to represent a particular sound. So for instance, long mid-vowels are diphthongized phonetically. And for a while, people weren't sure whether they should represent that orthographically. And so what people decided to do was to allow both ways of representing words. And I've noticed that although people agreed to allow that variation, it just kind of leveled out over the years. It just disappeared. People started to write long vowels just with the 2 vowel symbols. Okay, so coming back to our particular case study, so if you're interested in how this gets represented in the orthography, so post-oralization gets represented with a nasal consonant, and prenasalization does not. So a very simple implementation here in the orthography. And this is kind of the representation for each one of the phonemes, or in some cases allophones in the language. So very, very close to phonemic representation of the language. Okay, and I'll just wrap up by showing you some kind of changes in the variation in the use of the orthography over the years. So you don't need to be paying attention to all of the words that you see on the screen here, but I'll draw your attention specifically to the representation. So I'm giving you the IPA here on the top, and you can see the way that different people have represented that word. And you'll notice that, for instance, there's this representation here where the nasal consonant isn't represented here. Instead, we have nasalization of the preceding vowel. So these were kind of the issues that were raised during the first orthography workshops, where there were a lot of inconsistencies in the way people were transcribing things. So in this particular sample here, you have 17% of phonemically oral vowels being transcribed as nasal, 54% of phonemically nasal consonants being written without a nasal consonant, and 5% of oral consonants being written as nasal. And in 2019, so 4 years later, those numbers went down quite a bit. So only 1% of oral vowels written as nasal, 41% of nasal consonants written as oral, and then the reverse had no occurrence in this particular set. So you can see that there's kind of convergence over time. So we've seen that the orthography of the language has kind of emerged naturally from the series of workshops and the use of speakers of this writing system outside of those workshops. But now we have a way of representing all the crucial contrasts, so 19 more contrasts than were allowed in the previous orthography, and it seems to be very intuitive to native speakers. Literacy rates have also increased substantially, so over the last 10 years, I've seen that Panãra, written Panãra, is a lot more widespread, both kind of in the community, like in the school, and on social media. And I also want to note that in 2019, there was an important meeting that happened in the community like the week after the 2019 literacy workshop, which was it was a community meeting with government officials to write up this official document that asserts the sovereignty of the Panãra community, the Panãra tribe, within the Brazilian territory. And for the very first time, they wrote that document in Panãra. So it was the first official document that they wrote in the language, which was a really big historic achievement for the community. And then in 2023 and 2024, I started to notice a bunch of people who had never been in any of the orthography workshops, just kind of reading and writing on their own. So, you know, it's got a life of its own now. But the children are now learning Panãra orthography in school rather than just Portuguese. So we've got a lot of successes here. And with that, I'll just wrap up here.